Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, April 20th, 2026, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, we use Patreon for our kind of supportive structure. It's the NPR PBS model here in the US, where I want the show to be free, and it will always be free. And even though I sell like some pre-roll kind of programmatic ads, that's a nothing burger. It really doesn't pay the way that host read ads used to. So we really do rely on the support of folks through Patreon. Individuals from all over pledge their support on an episodic basis, as little as, 50 cents, $1. And some much more. So I want to thank those of you who pledge much, much more, because you really are like the lifeblood of the show. You keep it going, and you make it so that I can do all my other jobs and still make this show, because I've got to pay my incredible team to keep this going. So I want to start with Chuck Blell, David J.E. Smith, Daniel Lang, Mary Neva, Will Dufresne, David Compton, Brian Holden, Gabo J., Ulrika Hagman, Pasquale Gelati, and Joe Wilkinson, and of course so many more. Thank you, thank you, thank you. All right. So what do I have for you this week? I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Jennifer Doleac. She is the Executive Vice President of Criminal Justice at Arnold Ventures, which is a philanthropy focused on evidence-based policy. And before moving into that space, she was an economics professor at both Texas A&M University and the University of Virginia. She's written for a bunch of different outlets. And, we'll talk about her academic training in a bit. But she has a new book out. It's called The Science of Second Chances, A Revolution in Criminal Justice. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Jennifer Doleac. Well, Jen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
I'm excited to talk about your new book, The Science of Second Chances, A Revolution in Criminal Justice. And for folks who have been listening to the show for a while, maybe not the whole time, because this show's been on air now for 14? No, I think longer, 16 years. I don't know. I don't even know. I can't keep track. It started as a pretty hard science show. I was mostly covering like physics, biology, chemistry, some environmental science. As I went back to school, finished my PhD, became a clinical psychologist, and moved more into like social justice areas, the show has definitely shifted in a lot of ways. We still cover a lot of, kind of hard science, but we've more and more been talking about social justice issues. And lately, the criminal justice system, I guess we can call it a system as a whole, has become just increasingly interesting to me because it is so fundamentally tied to so many aspects of our society. So I'm really excited to talk to you about what's working, what's not working, how we as a society are impacted, how change or reform is difficult, but what could be on the horizon. So before we even get into all of that, I just want to learn a little bit more about you. So you are trained as an economist, right?
That's right. Yes.
Okay.
And so I went to graduate school for economics. And I really, I knew that I loved the intuition and the toolkit that economics provides, but it really is a toolkit. It's a way of thinking about human behavior in terms of how people respond to incentives. But also economists have really focused on developing an empirical toolkit that distinguishes correlation from causation. So of all the social scientists out there, we're the most obsessed with causal questions and causal inference. And so we use randomized trials like the lab experiments that you'll see in the hard sciences, but out in the field, of course. But we also use natural experiments. So these are situations in the real world that sort people into treatment and control groups as if at random. So something that approximates that ideal lab experiment that we wish we could run, but that, of course, is a little bit messier because we're dealing with human beings out in the real world. And so those types of natural experiments are really the bread and butter of a researcher like myself, and that has really provided a cool and new opportunities to learn a lot about what works in the criminal justice space and how to make people's lives better.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think when a lot of people think of economics, they think simply of money, or when they think of the economy, they think of the money system. But what you're describing, in a lot of ways, sounds like kind of economics as a field of inquiry really is almost like a form of applied psychology or applied sociology, sort of human behavior, how humans make decisions, how they grapple with risk, how they grapple with, as you mentioned, incentives, uncertainty, and then how that affects these larger, maybe like political or social systems. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, people sometimes give economists a hard time for encroaching on other people's territory. We are certainly prone to doing that. And I think in general, most economists do think that almost any topic is fair game. Economics is everywhere. People are responding to incentives all over the place. But also that empirical toolkit I mentioned is really useful in all kinds of settings. And it helps us really quantify what the costs and benefits of different interventions are, different programs, different policies. And that's really useful for policymakers. So if we want to know how to make people healthier, make our healthcare system work better, if we want to know how to make our schools better, if we want to know how to make our prisons better, any of these spaces, this empirical toolkit is really useful for helping to crunch the numbers and get the biggest bang for our buck. And so, as I said, economists are the most obsessed with doing those kinds of calculations. And so we tend to be useful in many kinds of conversations.
And so I'm curious, you studied at Stanford and then you were a professor at both A&M and the University of Virginia
Mhm.
before moving into a sort of like philanthropic policy space. When you were a graduate student and then when you moved on into your academic appointments, what were some, because it does sound like econ as a whole is like such a broad field. What were some of your kind of personal areas of interest and inquiry?
Yeah, when I first went to graduate school, I think I assumed I would study education or the economics of education or higher education, probably because that's where I'd spent most of my life, right? Like
Mm.
that's the system I knew best. I'd been a student for a really long time. And and so it really wasn't until it was later in my graduate training where I and all of my colleagues were hunting around for these natural experiments that we could apply our new toolkit to. And I read a newspaper article about law enforcement DNA databases. And the
Mm.
point of the article was that it seems really arbitrary that in some state that all states are determining the rules about which groups of people convicted or arrested for certain crimes are required to provide DNA to the database. And so the rules differ from state to state. And that sets up situations where you could have identical people convicted of the exact same crime, one state apart, and one person's in the database and the other one isn't. And the point of the article is, isn't this silly, and isn't this bad policy? And it might be bad policy and it might be silly, but it's great for research. And so that's
Mm.
exactly the kind of setup that where it does feel arbitrary or even random that, identical people have different treatments. And so that sets up that natural experiment that someone like me is looking for. And so I started looking into, well, what do we know about the impacts of these law enforcement databases? They're used across the US, they're used around the world. And we really knew nothing. We knew nothing about the impact of this extremely common tool. Um, and so that became my dissertation. And
Mm.
and then I graduated in 2012 and was coming out of my PhD at a time when there were a few more senior economists who were really trying to develop a cohort of more junior scholars to focus on this topic, crime in the criminal justice system. And because economics really hadn't focused on this much previously.
Mm.
economic or education and health and development economics and all these other topics had been common in econ for a long time, but for various reasons, economists hadn't thought much about crime, and so we were way behind other fields like sociology and criminology in that sense.
Hmm.
And and so it was a little bit risky for a junior scholar to say, sure, I'll embark and define myself, in terms of this field where no one is doing this, and try to build a career. Academia can be very traditional in many ways, and so that's a risky path to go down. But there are just so many interesting and important questions in the public safety and criminal justice spaces, and the vast majority of them are questions where the toolkit that I have to be able to answer causal questions about what works and what doesn't. And if something works, how much does it work? How much does it move the needle? Those questions are really crucial for
Hmm.
for safety in communities, for the directions of people's lives. And we really know so much less than we should, given how important those questions are. And so, here I am, over a decade later, still fascinated by crime, and so that's where I've focused my attention.
Yeah, and so you've written for several outlets, but is this your first full-length book?
That's right. Yeah. So economics isn't really a book field; it's a journal article field, and
Hmm.
so this is my first book, and it's written for a broad audience. So, again, there's no professional incentive to write for other academics in this format, and my goal here was really to write something that could communicate all of the ideas that are swirling around in academic circles to that audience of interested citizens, policymakers, practitioners who want more information about how to help put people on a better path, who are involved in the criminal justice system, how to reduce recidivism and reoffending after people are convicted or spend time in prison for a crime. And my sense was really that, and still is, that the cable news conversation about crime and criminal justice is really divorced from from the evidence and from what
Mm.
scholars talk about in the academy and the types of interventions that we're excited about and that we're seeing are effective. I think in the cable news space, you have this traditional argument between kind of the far left saying we need to defund police and defund prison and just invest in social services, and that's how we reduce crime. And the far right is saying the only way to reduce crime is to just lock people up at the first sign of moral weakness. And some people are
Mhm.
just bad people and there's nothing you can do. And I think the middle 90% of the country looks at those two um, proposals and they're like, those are our options,
Right.
and it's just really unsatisfying. And someone like me coming into the policy space, as you said, I joined Arnold Ventures about 2.5 years ago, which is a philanthropy that focuses on evidence-based policy. So now I spend a lot more time in the policy space and talking to lawmakers and practitioners. And the conversations that my colleagues were having, that I'm hearing from lawmakers, they're just so completely different from anything we talked about in the research space. And so I was really able to come into this space with fresh eyes and much less wed to the traditional ways that these conversations were had. And it just seemed like an opportunity, and still does. I mean, I think this is the most exciting piece of the work, that there are so many things we know do work and we know how to learn more. We have a sense that there probably are more solutions out there. We just need to find them. And so it makes me very optimistic about what's possible in this policy space. And my interactions with lawmakers continue to impress me and continue to, support that optimism, or they just genuinely don't know and they don't know any researchers. And so being able to connect these two worlds has tremendous upside.
I'm so excited about this conversation as somebody who identifies as, like a scientific skeptic, a science-based or evidence-based thinker. When I work in another podcast, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, where that's basically what we do, is we debunk pseudoscience, and we kind of teach critical thinking skills and neuropsychological humility, understanding cognitive biases, all these different things. I'm curious, sort of just at the tip, I guess, of the iceberg here, could you give us an example of maybe an obvious situation in which there's something that's just like well known to be evidence based when it comes to criminal justice policy in research or academic circles, but like within the political, the public, the media arena, like the conversations are just super divorced, like you mentioned? Like, is there just an area or a specific talking point where you're like, why does this persist? Like, we have evidence that it fully flies in the face of this. Like, could you give us an example of that?
Yeah, I a bunch of examples are coming to mind, but one,
Yeah.
one that I spend a lot of time talking about now, because I do think it could really move the needle if we can change the conversation, is how we deter crime, right? And
Mm,
so I'm an economist. I think people respond to incentives. I think that the way to change behavior is to change the costs and benefits that people respond to, and so to get people to commit less crime, you either have to reduce the benefits of committing crime.
mhm,
That's kind of hard to do. Or you can
mhm,
increase the cost of committing crime. And so that's where the criminal justice system and law enforcement come in. And there are two ways to increase the perceived cost or the expected cost of committing crime for someone who's considering doing so. One is to increase the punishment that they would receive if they
mhm,
are caught. And the other is to increase the probability that they are caught. So,
mm,
so there's some chance that you're caught, and then if you are caught, conditional on being caught, you'll face some punishment. But if you're not caught, then you don't face any punishment. And so it's sort of a probability, and you multiply the two together, and that's how you get the expected cost of committing crime.
mhm.
And for many decades in the United States, and the US is better than this at this than any other country, we have really, really focused on increasing sentences. So really tried that lever, that rule. If we want to deter crime, let's just make punishment harsher and longer.
Yeah,
And
so we
so
had these like mandatory minimums, and we had all of these
exactly,
policies for a long
sense
time that were like
enhancements.
really punitive. Yeah.
Yeah, and still, I mean, I think even the most recent during COVID, we had increases in homicides and shootings, and that scared everybody. And so, I think for understandable reasons, lawmakers are saying we have to crack down on this. We have to figure out how to prevent crime. We'll just make sentences longer. And so you see, all of these sentence enhancements and truth in sentencing bills and all these different types of policies that are really aimed at locking people up for longer. This is the way we're going to
Mm,
reduce crime. And but what we know from lots and lots of research is that the thing that changes behavior is not the long sentences, although it's a perfectly reasonable idea. In practice, it turns out that most people who are at risk of committing crime, the people we're trying to deter, they're simply not thinking that far ahead. And
mm,
so
mhm,
changing a punishment from 1 year to 2 years to 5 years to 10 years in prison, none of that is registering if they're not thinking past this week or this month. And so
mhm,
what does matter, though, is increasing the probability of facing consequences. And so the swiftness and certainty of punishment is how it's
mm,
often phrased. And so if you can increase the likelihood that people get caught and face any consequences, that really moves the needle. If you have consistent, reliable consequences that people know they're going to face, and then it doesn't really matter how long the prison sentence is. It's just increasing the likelihood that they get caught. And that really matters because in the United States, the likelihood that you get caught for crime is really low. And I think most
mm.
people are really surprised by how low clearance rates is how we typically measure this. This is basically the share of reported crimes that results in an arrest. So clearance rates in the US hover between 50 and 60% for homicide. So if you commit
Okay.
homicide, it's basically a coin flip whether you get arrested or not.
And that's just getting arrested, not
That's just
convicted.
getting arrested. Exactly. So some of those
Yeah.
people are not being convicted, right? So it's a coin flip even getting
Mhm,
arrested.
mhm,
But that's the best case scenario. Any other crime, less serious crimes, when you think about still felonies. Think about theft or larceny, burglary. The probability of getting caught or the clearance rate is about 10 to 15%.
Oh God. And what about like, I wouldn't say equally, well, I don't even want to put a moral judgment on this, but like severe crime like rape, isn't the clearance rate like
Oh my gosh.
abysmal?
Abysmal, because it is, because
Yeah.
even those crimes, you have the double whammy of people aren't reporting. And then
Hmm.
the share of the report. So all we can see really is the share of reported crimes that
Yeah.
result in an arrest. And so, of course, if people or communities don't trust that the police are actually going to do anything, then they're going to stop reporting the crime. So this is a well-known
Hmm.
issue in gender-based violence like rape. It's also an issue for like bike theft, right? Like I have a ton of friends who've had their bikes stolen, and after they've had their first bike stolen, they report it to the police. They don't do anything. When their second bike's stolen, they don't even
Right.
bother, right? And
Yeah.
so there's a lot of,
Yeah.
especially the low level crimes, you don't even bother reporting to the police because you figure it's not gonna be a priority. And in defense of the police, like they're triaging, they're trying to figure out, they're trying to solve the homicides. But
Hmm.
this does mean that we've set up a system where the vast majority of our criminal justice funding is going to keeping people in prison for a really long time. And if we invested even a small share of those resources, shifted those resources and that attention to helping police solve more crimes faster, we would get a huge bang for our buck and a huge reduction in crime. And again, this is something that like everyone in the academy knows. Researchers know this. We've known this for a long time. The evidence keeps getting better and better, but we've known this basic concept for a long time. But
Hmm.
we talk to lawmakers about it and their minds are just blown, right? And you can see it like makes sense to you once you explain it. And they're like, oh my gosh, we've been doing this all backwards. It's like, yes, we've been doing it all backwards. So
But
that's
of
a very
course,
mental issue. Yeah.
there are incentives, I think, to continuing to do it backwards for a lot of simply because of the way that our economic system functions in this country. It does seem to be lower hanging fruit to get people into the prison pipeline and keep them there as opposed to changing or improving policing, because we've tried to change and improve policing a lot, and we've tried a lot of things that, as you mentioned, don't really work. We funnel a lot of money into policing, but it doesn't seem to, as you're saying, have the outcome. Like we know what we want to get out of it, right? As you mentioned, less kind of defer crime would be deferred better if we spent less of our, let's say, resources on keeping people in prison longer and more of our resources on ensuring that people who commit crime go to prison. But in
Mhm.
practice, is that easy to do?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. We do spend a lot of money on policing. We've tried lots of things in policing, but my sense is that we really haven't focused on this aspect of
Mm,
policing. So
mhm.
there's tons of evidence at this point that hiring more police, putting more police on the streets, that does reduce crime, and that is primarily through deterrence. If you see a cop standing on a street corner, you're not going to steal the car right in front of him, right? You know you're going to get
Mhm.
caught.
Yeah.
So that's like that basic concept in action. Increase the probability of getting caught, then you'll reduce crime. But so most attention in the policing world has really gone into just patrol, like having officers out on patrol to deter
Mhm.
crime in that way. And there's been much less attention and experimentation and learning around how to solve crimes after they've happened. And so, for
Okay.
instance, it turns out, and this is something like I've been learning a lot along with my team about all of this as we try to think about how can we help states and cities do better on this dimension. Because you're right, there is a way in which, for lawmakers who care about this, it's really straightforward to just write into statute that sentences for this crime are now longer than they were before, right? That's a really
Yeah, it just feels like cheaper and easier to do, so they're like, "Let's do the easy thing." Yeah.
And so, but it's not effective. And so it's like, okay, so
Right.
how can we help lawmakers um, do things better here? And so there are bills that many states are considering where that would provide funding to law enforcement specifically focused on interventions that would reduce or that would solve more crimes. So you can use
Okay.
the money for forensic analysis or DNA analysis. You can use the money for license plate readers or new tech. You can hire more detectives, say. But something else that I found really surprising and that has motivated some work that we're supporting is that it turns out most detectives in the country don't really get any training as detectives.
Mm,
People tend to get promoted to be a detective based on seniority or because they seem to have good people skills or something like that. But then they just are expected to learn on the job. And
hmm
so, this is a really important crime or a really important job. And so, wouldn't it be useful if they were trained in some way with the skills they need to be able to do that job well? And so, we're partnering. We, being Arnold Ventures, is partnering with PERF, the Police Executive Research Forum, to develop a training curriculum for detectives. And so, basically, could we just create a detective school essentially, and then we're going to roll it out as a randomized trial so that we can learn what the impact is. But there's just a lot of low hanging fruit like that out there.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Crime labs are super backlogged. We don't really prioritize evidence going through those crime labs in any sort of useful way. There's just so much we could be doing better, that I think we haven't really focused on it in the past, and so we haven't learned what works.
And I'm curious, just from a sort of evidence based perspective, one of the things that you mentioned about deterring crime is, increasing the incentive not to commit a crime or decreasing the
Mhm.
incentive to commit a crime. Um, and I can't help but think about like recidivism as another knock against these like long prison sentences, because
Yeah.
I'm curious if you've looked at the data here. Do people who end up staying in prison for a very long time, are they more or less likely to repeat? My guess is that they're not getting a lot of rehabilitation and they're just languishing. And so when they get out, they're having a really hard time re-entering into society. And there's less incentive not to commit crimes then. But do we know
Yeah.
what the data show?
Yeah, so there has been a bunch of research using natural experiments where,
Mhm.
we'd love to know what the effect of going to prison is on someone, right? And
Mhm.
so the ideal experiment is you randomly send some people to prison and others not. And obviously
Right,
we
which would be horrifically unethical. Yeah.
that would be
But
illegal
as
and
you mentioned, but you're right. You mentioned that there are places in the country where
uh-huh,
like well,
the law
like
change
yeah, the laws
or
are different.
Yep, exactly. So this is a place where we use these natural experiments. So either sentencing guidelines where people are just above or below the threshold that puts them into a
Mhm.
different category, or there's a policy change, or something that's very common is that cases are randomly assigned to different judges. And
Mm.
different judges have different inclinations naturally. Some are more lenient and some are more harsh. And so if you get lucky and you get a more lenient judge who's less likely to send you to prison or who sentences you to a lower sentence, we can compare you to someone who got unlucky and got the harsher judge and so got a longer sentence. And so through all of
Mhm.
that, there's a general, I think, the interesting result that's coming out of this literature is that the sentence, like we can see in the data that if you are convicted and go to prison, your employment rates when you get out are much lower than they were before. They were already low, but you're much lower.
Yeah, yeah.
And we know recidivism rates are really high, and so we can see that at the very least, we're not doing a very good job of using prison
Mhm.
effectively as an intervention point. But what's interesting coming out of the research is that most of that impact on employment in particular seems to be coming from the conviction, having a criminal record itself, having something on your
At
record
all.
rather than the
Okay.
incarceration spell. Now, the
Mhm.
incarceration spell is I really think of as an intervention point, that we've got you in a place for some period of time, often a long period of time, where you have nothing else to do. Wouldn't that be a great opportunity to make lots of education available to you,
Right.
of mental health treatments, lots of, job training, whatever it is that would help.
Yeah, but we know that doesn't happen. I mean, only in very ideal situations.
So I think a lot of prisons, they have it. I mean, I think the challenge is we don't really have great data on which programs are effective and which ones aren't,
Okay.
because because the programs tend to be held out for people based on good behavior, or you select into them based on your motivation or your interest. And so then it's really hard to tell what the value add of certain programs is.
Mhm.
So we're just starting to get better data on like exactly which programs should we have people taking, and does, a college degree actually help, or does the criminal record itself, is that such a barrier that it doesn't matter what your education is? And so
Mhm.
there are a lot of open questions about, which types of programs are actually good investments in terms of money, in terms
Mhm.
of time, and scarce resources. Prisons tend to be really understaffed, so often these programs are the first thing that are cut when they're really worried about safety, and don't have enough officers on staff. And so this is all to say, like, this is. I think there's a general perception that, there's Norway that does this really well and has this really rehabilitative model, and that U.S. prisons have none of this. And that's not true. They do. I mean, prisons across
Mhm.
the country do have a lot of programming. It's just we could be doing so much better. And there is a lot of variation across different facilities, of course, and across different states. Um, and the labor shortages are a huge issue. So this is all to say, I think, we could increase the probability of getting caught, but for the people who do wind up incarcerated, then we know that long sentences are not having the deterrent effect on future crime that we would like. We also know that locking people up for long periods of time doesn't really have much of what we call an incapacitation effect. Like, the other reason to lock people
Mm.
up, they're an active public safety threat. And so you want to take them
Right,
out of
is
the
to take them
right?
out.
Like,
Yeah.
there will always be a role for jail and prison for some people, right? Where there's some people
Mhm.
where we're just going to have to lock them up. But it turns out most people who commit crime age out of crime really quickly. Like, people do a lot of
Mhm.
dumb, reckless, impulsive stuff when they're teenagers and young adults, and then they grow
Yeah.
up. And of course, some people, there are exceptions out there who will continue to be violent into their, adult years. But those exceptions really do prove the rule that most people just do this stuff when they're teens and young adults, and then they grow up. And so locking someone, if someone's committed a crime when they're 16, 18, 19, locking them up for 20, 30 years, by the time they're 40 or 50 years old, they're definitely not a public safety threat anymore. At that point, we're not getting any public safety for that money
Yeah.
and for that time that
Yeah.
we're keeping
Yeah.
them out of their community. And so yeah, I think there are a lot of opportunities to use prison in a more cost-effective way, in a way that is actually, putting people on a better path rather than just using it as a holding pen, right? That's a really expensive
Mhm.
holding if that's all we can get out
Right.
of it. But it is an intervention point for people who are clearly struggling in their lives, right? People don't wind up in prison because everything's going well for them. And so it is a chance to really help people level up and leave better than they came in. And I think it's just a really missed opportunity that we don't take don't use that opportunity as much as we can.
That makes sense. I think when we think about some of the more progressive or liberal or left wing reform, um, rally cries, one of the things that we talk about a lot is the sort of the new Jim Crow of it all, the deeply racial components of our criminal justice system, and the uh, I think the fair amount of evidence that exists out there that whether we're talking about policing or later about convictions and the prison system itself, that individuals who come from poor backgrounds, individuals who are Black or brown, individuals from certain neighborhoods, they do tend to experience harsher treatment on the streets and also harsher punishments for similar crimes. And I'm
Mhm.
curious, how much of your work dives into the social justice and kind of the racial components of our criminal justice system.
I have studied that a bit myself. There are definitely other
Hmm.
researchers who spend a lot of time on it. My view, one thing about economists and the economics toolkit
Hmm.
is I very much view my role as saying, you tell me what problem you're trying to solve. You tell me what your goal is and what your
Hmm.
constraints are, and I will help you optimize and I'll optimize the allocation of your scarce resources to meet your goal. So for some
Yeah.
policymakers, the only thing they care about is reducing crime rates. And so, okay, let's figure out how to reduce crime rates. For all other policymakers, the only thing they care about is racial disparities. Let's reduce racial
Hmm.
disparities. Others will say both of those things matter, right? The harms of the system matter and public safety matters. I think, frankly, that's most that's most law
Yeah, yeah,
enforcement.
yeah. I would hope so. Yeah.
We can do both. Both matter, and we should be talking about both.
Hmm.
And then it's just a matter of like, well, how are we weighting these two things, and is there a way? So I think this is another place where the general perception is there's this like we're in a zero sum situation where we can
Yeah.
either have more public safety or we can have less harm from the system and less racial injustice. And and we're just arguing, like the left and right are arguing about where on that like super efficient frontier we are landing. But you can't improve
Hmm.
things. And the reality is there is so much inefficiency throughout the system that we can have less crime and less punishment and spend less money and reduce racial disparities. And we can do all of these things and make everyone better off because we're just so far from an optimal, efficient system. Um, and so what I wind up thinking a lot about is to more directly to your question is what I find to be the more interesting questions are less about like how do we simply minimize disparities, but
Hmm.
um, or what the disparities are, but how we can actually like what interventions are actually effective at reaching those goals, right? So I think often people will just sort of look descriptively at data and see that um, this court is incarcerating Black defendants at much higher rates, and that seems really unfair, and kind of like just like normatively saying this is an unfair outcome. And there's certainly a place for describing the problems with the system. As you said, I think a lot of people now are familiar with the new Jim Crow. Like, I think we have a sense at this point of like what the problems with the system are. The question
Hmm.
now is how to fix it, right? Like, what do we
Right,
do
right.
now? Like, what's next? And that's where I think things get really interesting because a lot of our good ideas aren't going to work, right? A lot of the things
Hmm.
that like might be obvious what the problem is, and even if we all agree on what the problem is, that doesn't mean like our best idea. If we all put our heads together and think about our 5 good ideas and we narrow it down to the one best idea we have, I would put good money on that idea, not knowing what it is, that it's not going to work. Because most things we
Hmm.
try don't work. These are really complicated problems. Human behavior surprises us. And so we have to be out there trying things, but do it with a lot of humility so that we don't become wed to solutions before we know if they're effective.
Yeah, and I think I consider myself a really progressive thinker, and I do hear these calls, like you mentioned before at the beginning of the show. I'm definitely not a tough on crime. We need like stronger and harsher, like approaches. I'm definitely probably tend towards the left. But when I hear the rallying cry of just like fully defund the police, there's
Mhm.
something in it that doesn't feel like, I imagine a world where we do have incredible social systems, right? Yes, if in the United States people didn't have medical debt or educational debt and everybody could afford a home, and there were just like more opportunities for individuals to exist within a middle class, and there was no redlining, and there was no racial violence, and there was no, obviously if there was a utopian world, there would be significantly less crime. I think we can all agree on that. But the problem is there would still be some crime. And
Mhm.
when there's a threat to public safety, how do we make sure that everybody is safe? And so I think, defunding the police maybe is an extreme cry. Maybe the people who say defund really just mean dramatically reduce the funding or allocate it towards other places.
Yeah.
But that really, I guess, brings us to that question, and sort of like where you're going, because I think that is, on the far left at least, that is their best idea that they've come up with, right? Is, let's look at all the data. The police are getting so much of our money, and they are
Mhm.
committing so many atrocities, and nothing feels better, everything feels worse. What would
Mhm.
happen if we had a dramatic change and we burned down the system? But it sounds
Right.
like what you're saying is that's probably not the best approach to fixing all the broken things that are in front of us.
Or even just, I mean, I think my perspective is basically just a very pragmatic one, that
Mhm.
even if that would work and sounds great. Yeah, if we found a way to eliminate poverty, I do think that we could dramatically,
Exactly.
right? Like, I do think that would be effective. But my question is, like, how do we do that? Right? Like, what is your plan?
Mhm.
What is, like, we're at step
Yeah,
A now, what's step B? Right? Like, how do we get from, how do we get there? And there isn't an actual plan for how we get to that utopia. And so,
right.
yeah, this idea, I mean, part of the other reason I really wrote the book is, I think the other idea floating around in the cable news ecosystem is that the only way to make meaningful progress on these many problems we see in the world and in the public safety space specifically, the only possible solution that's going to have any impact is major structural reform, and is to burn
Mhm.
it all down. And I, we have so much evidence of small incremental changes, things that are implemented in states and cities right now that could easily be implemented elsewhere, that have really meaningful impacts on behavior and on trajectories and people's, future criminal behavior, on their employment outcomes, on all kinds of good things, um, that don't require big structural reform. I also
Mm.
think big structural reform, frankly, just isn't going to happen. Like, we're not going to burn it all down,
Right,
right?
right.
And
It's
so
just, yeah, it's too
pragmatically,
ideal.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's like, I appreciate the idealism, but the pragmatist in me is like, okay, so there are people who need our help right now. So what are we doing for them?
Mhm.
And I do think
Mhm.
there's a way in which those calls for structural reform really do let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and keep us from making meaningful change that we could make today, where we have evidence that would move the needle substantially today. And I think, saying, well, none of that's going to work until we have structural reform, is just an excuse sometimes to just not do anything. And
Yeah.
I become very frustrated with that.
Yeah, and so let's talk about some of those meaningful, like incremental, evidence-based, maybe seemingly small changes
Mhm.
that we could be making that actually would have a massive outcome. I mean, you did kind of touch on one, like if
Yeah,
there are more, just like the presence of more police. They don't even have to be doing anything, right? Just like
yeah. Uh-huh.
knowing that there are more public safety officers, and let's think of them that way,
Mhm.
present, helps neighborhoods feel safer, and it does deter people. We've all been driving down the road and you see a cop and you slow down, right? Like, it works. We know it works. So
Totally.
there's one thing. We know not keeping people in prison longer, but it
Yeah, and so
actually.
along the same lines as
Mhm.
policing, increasing the probability of getting caught, there's evidence on the impacts from my own research on the impacts of adding people to DNA databases, that it reduces future recidivism by over 40%.
Oh,
So
like
it's
if
a
you know that if you commit a murder or a rape and now your DNA is in the system, like you will get caught. So
you're
probably
much
don't do
more
that
likely to
again.
get caught, and not just for murder
Yeah.
or rape, it's for all kinds of, like, burglary, like,
Mm,
lots of offenses, and so, because the technology's evolved so much now, so just increasing the probability that people get caught really does change. It's like, that's the wake-up call, that's the nudge, they need to say,
mhm,
"Okay, I better go get a job. I better go, like, I better stop hanging out with those friends that are always getting me into trouble,"
mhm.
and really it's a time to clean up their act. And the effect is biggest for younger defendants and younger people who are charged with crimes. And so I think that's also
Mm.
really informative. Like, the earlier we can get people into these, or have this type of intervention, whether it's a DNA database or something else, people who are younger have more opportunity to course correct, right? They can, it's still possible for them to take a different path.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
it's just harder when you get older. So that's one, is just increase the probability of getting caught. Like, that has a big deterrent effect, which not only reduces crime, it improves the lives of the people who are no longer committing crime, right? Like, they're doing better things.
And that's
Um,
something I think that's really important, not to interject and, like, hold that thought because I wanna know the next thing, but
yeah.
one of the things that frustrates me is something you mentioned earlier, and then you also mentioned kind of in passing here when you were like, do something different, do something better, like get the job. But our criminal justice system is built in such a way that people who have committed felony crimes have a harder time getting jobs. So
Yes.
wouldn't that be like a massive policy change that would have sweeping downstream effects?
Yeah, so this is a place that I've spent a lot of time, and a lot of my own research, and I find fascinating. So
Mm,
this policy space is a great example of one where solving this problem is much easier said than done. So
okay.
it is a huge, like, I think, completely agree that figuring out how to help people with criminal records get jobs, like find employment, get onto a more stable path. This is super important. It's really difficult to imagine someone living a stable, crime-free life without steady employment, right? Like, you need a
Mhm.
job. And we also have lots of evidence that employers routinely discriminate against people with criminal records. There's something about that record that really worries them. They don't wanna hire them.
Well, and we're, like, legally required to ensure that that record is disclosed, right?
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, obviously that's changing
Yeah,
in
yeah,
various
yeah.
places. They're changing policies. But I think so the approach here to solve this problem has been to go after that issue, that the availability of the information, right? So if
Mm,
we see that employers are discriminating against people with criminal records, we don't want them to. We wish they didn't, right? It would be better for all of
mhm,
us to care about that record. So let's pass a law that says they can't ask anymore.
mm,
And so that's ban the box. So there's traditionally a box on a job application that you check if it says, have you ever been convicted of a crime or do you have a felony conviction? And if you check that box, anecdotally, employers just throw your application in the trash. They don't even give you a
right,
chance, right? And
right.
that's really unfair. That's really unfair, especially for people who have done the work, have, turned their lives around and really are serious and would be good employees. That also, frankly, is bad for the employer if they're missing out on good matches, right? Anyone who talks to small business owners knows, like, everyone's desperate for good, reliable workers who are going to show up on time every day, and they want them to start yesterday, right? And so
Mhm.
the fact that there are good potential employees out there and employers aren't able to see them or identify them, that's a market failure in my view. That's, like, for economists, that's like a blinking red light. That's a market failure, right? That's bad for
Okay.
everybody. And so
Yeah.
there's something going on here that's problematic. But anyway, so ban the box says, let's take that box off the application. The idea will be people with criminal records can get their foot in the door, build rapport with, the employer. And by the time that the employer does do a background check at the end of the process, hopefully they won't care about the record anymore. They'll have more context for it. And then the person will be more likely to get a job. I heard about this policy and, I spent a lot of time studying discrimination and think about incentives. And I immediately, and a lot of my econ colleagues immediately, were worried this policy would backfire, because if employers are worried about a criminal record for some reason, and we're not doing anything to change their underlying incentives about that record, um, but now we tell them they can't ask anymore, I would
Hmm.
expect them to use whatever remaining information they have to try to guess. And
Right. Yeah.
so then what we wind up, and then so there's a bunch of research now showing that what winds up happening is that it just increases racial discrimination. It essentially broadens the
Hmm.
discrimination from um, people with criminal records to like all young Black men.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Like, let's
yeah,
just assume that you're a
let's
criminal.
just assume.
Yeah.
Let's just assume. And so
Yeah.
it's backfired. And so and there's evidence coming out that that clean slate, which seals records, because then people are like, well, the problem is the background check. Let's take the background check out, um, which wasn't the the core issue, but clean slate is we don't have evidence on unintended consequences yet, or maybe I might have seen one paper, but there's definitely solid evidence that it's not increasing employment. It's just not working. And
Okay.
ban the box it
Hmm.
didn't work to increase employment for those with records either. And so
Hmm.
so my take at this point is like, look, this is a really important problem to solve. The first things we tried didn't work, but we need to keep trying. So like what's next? And my view where I'm really optimistic is in thinking about, you know, take the employers and say, okay, there's something about the criminal record they're worried about. Let's figure out what they're worried about and directly address those concerns. And so, one
Okay.
example is, if what they're worried about is that the person isn't going to be reliable and they're not going to show up on time every day. Well, how can we provide more information that actually they would, right, to help make these matches happen? So maybe it's a glowing recommendation from some reentry program they went through, something like that. Another example that I'm super excited about is insurance. So employers will tell you that what they worry about when they're considering hiring someone with a record is the risk associated with that. They're worried that someone will continue to commit crime on the job, that they might, assault another employee or a customer, they might steal from them, um,
Hmm.
and so employers typically all employers typically buy commercial insurance to cover their employees if there's theft on the job or something like that. But commercial insurance standard policies exclude coverage for anyone with a criminal record. And so
Oh, well, there you go.
right. And so that kind of leads you down this rabbit hole of like, okay, well, why do they do that? And why, if the market, so that we now have some evidence that actually providing insurance that does cover people with records really does move the needle. It does get employers to hire people with records. And so then the question becomes, well, why doesn't the market provide this? And it might just be that they genuinely don't know how to price the risk. They've never covered this population before. And so that's a
Mm.
place where, I'm now to philanthropy. We could think about, well, could we come up with some pilot product where we can cover the losses for a little while just to get the data to kind of help make the market here. But that's the sort of intervention where I think I'm much more optimistic that something like that will be effective because it directly addresses a concern and changes the
Yeah.
incentives that employers are responding to. And ultimately employers are just they're just trying to make a profit, right? These are the most rational actors we have. And so tweaking the costs and benefits that they're responding to should have a big benefit, should have a big
Yeah, yeah. I agree, but it would I would just think that it would need to be subsidized, as you mentioned. Like,
yeah.
even if that type of insurance is available, I don't see employers choosing to buy a more expensive premium because it allows them to hire people that they already wanted to discriminate against in the first place, right? Like, it would have to be subsidized, hopefully, by the funding that we're already putting towards our criminal justice system. Like, that seems like a fair way to
Yeah.
monetize a program like that because it's actually a program that is attempting to reduce recidivism.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So there's the make more matches component here, and there might be employers might be willing to pay something to have access to employees to kind of shift the risk or smooth the risk if they're just hiring one person. And but I completely agree. If part of the other big market failure here is that we have what economists would call externalities to an individual decision. So the business owner
Mhm.
is making a decision about whom to hire based on who's most profitable for them, right? Who's going to be most reliable, who's going to, help their business succeed as best as possible. But we all benefit if they hire someone with a criminal record because that person is less likely to commit crime going forward, right? There's a benefit to the whole community. And it's completely reasonable that the employer would not take into consideration that benefit to the community when they're considering whom to hire. But so the way to address that is still that's a market failure. There are social benefits that aren't being internalized. So the way we can do that, the way we do that in general with taxation and subsidies, is we can subsidize the product. We can have our tax dollars chip in to basically say, we will all benefit, so it's worth it to us to chip in and help subsidize your hiring of this person.
Yes.
So I completely agree that I think going forward, there'll be some subsidy from the government, but just having the product exist in the first place will will also be important.
Yeah. And I mean, I hate to sound cynical about this, but like, wow, what a liberal policy. Like, that's the thing that I think I struggle with here is that, like, the opposite side of externalizing cost, or you were talking about externalizing benefit, but is, we know we live in a capitalist marketplace now where so many externalized costs are not carried by the very actors that are causing them, right? Like, a gas and oil fossil fuel company, or a manufacturer like a textile or dye manufacturer, or anybody who's making synthetic chemicals. When we see these externalized costs on the environment, on health and human safety, that cost gets passed on to the people. It doesn't get until there's like a lawsuit usually, but it's not built into the system for the actual corporation or the organization to pay. I think about plastic. Plastic is a great example. Like Coca-Cola and Aquafina are not paying for the cost of plastic in the environment. They're making us feel like it's our fault, right? Like they're just fully shirking the externalized costs of that. And I just worry that our system as it stands right now is such an anti regulatory system that we aren't interested in making policy changes like that. I mean, there are people that are interested. You are interested in it. There's a whole, political party that's, always pushing for this. But I do worry about how popular these types of evidence-based changes can be when we have politicians in front of us, when we have what we think of as rational actors in front of us, and we go, look at this evidence. Ultimately, your constituents will be happier because there will be less crime and they will have more money and they will, all these great outcomes. And they go, yeah, don't like it. Doesn't make me sound tough. Like that there's still a human psychology component here, right? That's like hard to get past.
Yeah. I think, when I first took this job, I think that was my fear about most conversations with lawmakers, that it was just going to be like me saying, the evidence says X, you should do it. And they're going to say, I don't care. And that's just, I've been very pleasantly surprised. So over the last few weeks, I was out in Salt Lake City in Utah. I came back from Phoenix and Arizona, talking with lawmakers in both very red states. And this insurance idea people loved in both places, right? I mean, I think part of it is just sort of like recognizing employers as part of the solution, right? And seeing this as just like, oh yeah, employers are trying to like hire people. How do we make it easier for them to hire people that, we all see as it's better for us if they can get a job. So this is, I think ultimately it's just it could have gone either way. I think I was sort of expecting the kind of pushback you're talking about, but my experience actually talking to lawmakers at the state level, and that's where most criminal justice policy happens, is they're just really pragmatic. Like they have to balance their budget. Prison's really expensive, prison's really expensive. And if that is the only way if that's the only tool we have to reduce crime, then their budgets are busted every year. And so what else can we be doing? What can we do to increase efficiency? What can we do to help reduce crime and get more public safety in a way that isn't exorbitantly expensive? And having, even just having a kind of approach like the insurance one that is sort of based on incentives and markets does appeal to a lot of conservatives and people from the business community. I think in practice, like all of my interactions with the political system at this point leave me feeling so optimistic about how much room there is, and how much, like, the only constraint really is just like the bandwidth of me and my colleagues and researchers.
Yeah,
We know
yeah.
there are so many lawmakers out there. They work part-time. They have a full-time job on the side, right? Because that's what state lawmaker roles are. And they don't have a staff. And so they're just trying to figure out, like, there are 500 bills that are introduced this session. How are they going to read them all and have an informed opinion about them? And which ones should they be introducing next session? And they just need some help. And
Mhm.
so I find that that's much more the constraint. They're just looking for new ideas that could actually work. And the cable news politics of it doesn't enter into the equation as much as I had feared.
That's so good to hear because I would agree that ultimately, I mean, I think it's part of why I'm so drawn to the concept and the community around science-based thinking, whether it's science-based medicine, science-based social policy, fill in the blank. Ultimately, the more evidence we can collect and the more we can show, the numbers can lie, the numbers can be made to lie, but ultimately, over that's this is the scientific community is self-correcting, right? The more we amass and the
Right.
more people kind of contribute to the story, the more a narrative comes out that has higher and higher fidelity, right? That is more and more able to approximate reality. And ultimately, yes, I think there will always be bad actors who say, ideologically, I have an agenda and I will only choose evidence that supports my agenda. I will only operate from a confirmation bias perspective. And ultimately, what matters most to me is that my policies, my ideologies are backed. But I think that a lot of people's ideologies and policies can actually shift and change and adjust when they feel like they have a good grasp of the nature of reality. And a lot of the times the problem is that we don't give people alternative ways of thinking. We say, well, you're wrong. And they go, okay, but then what's right? And we go, I don't know. You know? And so one of the best approaches is not to say you're wrong, neener. It's to say, have you thought about it this way? Have you
Yeah,
looked at this alternative way of thinking about it? Because if there's nothing to plug in, we're
mm,
always going to just see pushback, right? But
totally.
it's hard when you've got a bipartisan like think tank, or when you've got individuals on multiple sides of an aisle saying,
Mhm,
well, the evidence shows us this, so we all kind of agree here.
mhm, mhm.
It's hard to say no, I don't want to.
Yeah. And I mean, in the criminal justice space, this desire for retribution is such a driving
Hmm.
force in so many conversations about
Hmm.
why we incarcerate people. And so, I mean, this is an example of a place where, data, empirical evidence, the kinds of studies I can do will have no bearing on how much retribution or mercy someone deserves, right? And how,
Yeah, yeah,
what
yeah.
what they deserve based on
Mhm.
moral or ethical grounds. But regardless of what your views are about retribution, presumably we would all like less crime for less money. And so,
Right.
we can, like, take your desire for retribution as given and say, like, okay, we can work with that. Like, you weight that a lot and you get a lot of value out of that. That's fine. Let's just be clear about how much you're paying for that, right? And
Yeah,
the
yeah.
things that you could get instead. Like, there are trade-offs here. There are opportunity costs. If we're spending $1 zillion to keep this person in prison for an extra 40 years, that's a lot of money that we don't get to invest in solving more crimes and DNA analysis or schools or healthcare or whatever else we could use with those tax dollars. And so it's just sort of, I think my approach and perspective, um, based on all my training, is to really, take people's preferences as given. Like, it's not my job to tell people they should be more merciful or not.
Mhm.
But just to really help clarify, to the extent that what they do care about is public safety, and I think everyone cares at least somewhat about what the actual impact of these policies is on the ground. Those are empirical questions, and some of our programs and policies work better than others. And how do we maximize the ROI there? so
Yeah.
that we can have more good things, and people are happier and more productive and feel safer in their communities. And yeah, I feel like there's a lot of room for common ground here. Again, we're in such an inefficient place in this
Yeah, that
space.
there's so much room for improvement. Yeah.
Improvement, like we can
Yeah.
make everyone better off and everyone happier. This is not a zero sum fight.
I feel like that's such a good summary, and I can't help but like here in just the last couple of minutes, kind of the thing that comes to mind when you describe this idea of like, I'm not going to change somebody's moral preferences or their sort of ideologic reactions. I think about the death penalty, right? Like I am
Mm,
wildly against the death penalty from an ideologic perspective, but I was raised in Texas and I didn't always think that way. And I know
mhm.
people who I think I agree with on a lot of topics who are, on the fence, or maybe they think differently. But ultimately, if a person is imprisoned for the rest of their life without any chance of parole, or they are, killed by the state, they are removed from the public sphere, right? They are no longer a threat to the citizenry. And
Yeah.
so at that point, I think you're right. Like whether you feel like it's a retribution question or not, well, is it more expensive to keep to kill? Weirdly, it's very expensive to put somebody on death row. Like it's
Yep, yep,
surprisingly, you'd think it would be cheaper, but it's not. And
right.
so that's where those kinds of arguments, I think you're right, can be so gripping for a lot of people who maybe you do have a moral stance about it, but ultimately, let's look at the balance sheet as well, and let's look at how
Right.
your community could be improved with that savings.
Right. I mean, most of our preferences and our desires for justice and, whatever other moral and ethical views we might have are not absolute, right? They're
Mhm,
in, in
mhm.
conversation with other things we believe and other trade-offs. And so just helping people work through the trade-offs here, I think can be really constructive.
I love this. I love any conversation, argument, book that evokes not just a sense of curiosity about a really complex topic, but the discomfort that comes from being challenged in your kind of fundamental views, the discomfort that comes with sitting in the unknown a little bit and saying, "Ooh, the evidence might not fully comport with what I thought was reality." Like I always so appreciate anytime I feel challenged and I can grow and I can evolve, especially in a field where I don't have any expertise, and my perspectives are an amalgamation basically of just what I'm exposed to in life. And so I feel like, A, thank you for the conversation, but B, for the amount of work that you've done throughout your career, and culminating in this wonderful book that brings people to that place where they can go, I think there's other layers of depth that I can think about these topics. Or maybe some of the people who pick this book up have never thought about any of this at all. And
Yeah.
that's always a gift, right? Is to just have a spark and to start thinking deeply about things that we kind of took for granted. So I so appreciate the time that you spent with us today. I so appreciate the book. Everybody, it's called The Science of Second Chances: A Revolution in Criminal Justice by Dr. Jennifer Doleac. Did I pronounce that right, Jen?
You did.
Oh,
Yes.
good. Okay. Excellent. Thank you so much for being here. It was wonderful.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this conversation.
And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.